Good evening. I am Uyai Aniakan coming to you live from the beautiful hills of Ibiakuran. Today on Spotlight Africa, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa defies scandal to win party vote. President Said urged to resign after fiasco elections. In Libya, they've been given sentences of 17 people who are members to some deaths organized. Ethiopia's largest bank says Tigray services resume. Plus, Nairobi foots detained patients' bills for Christmas. These stories are all just ahead in Spotlight Africa. Do stay with us. First in Spotlight Africa, South Africa's scandal-hit President Cyril Ramaphosa has been re-elected as the governing ANC's leader to wild cheers from his supporters. He defeated his rival Zweli Mkhize by 2,476 votes to 1,897. Ramaphosa won despite being dogged by corruption. Both deny the allegations. His victory puts him in pole position to lead the ANC in the 2024 election, but he is still at risk as he is being investigated by police, the tax office and central bank over allegations that he stashed at least $580,000 in a sofa at his private firm and then covered it up after the theft. Meanwhile, a panel of legal experts appointed by the Speaker of Parliament said that he had a case to answer as he may have both violated the Constitution and broken an anti-corruption law. In Lesotho, a profile has now been put in place by the kingdom, which is made up of mostly the highlands, where many of the villages can be reached only on horseback, by foot or light aircraft. Resources are scarce, a consequence of the harsh environment of the highland plateau and limited agricultural space in the lowlands. The former British protectorate has been heavily dependent on the country, which completely surrounds it, South Africa. Over the decades, thousands of workers have been forced by the lack of job opportunities to find work at South African mines. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project was completed in the 90s to export water to South Africa. According to reports, Lesotho has one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, with 1 in 5 adults living with HIV and more infections per 100,000 people than most other countries, including neighboring Namibia, Botswana, and Eswatini. Meanwhile, Tunisia's main opposition coalition has said President Kais Saied must resign after fewer than 9% of eligible voters took part in the parliamentary elections. The National Salvation Front head, Najib Chebi, said Saturday's poll was a fiasco, calling for mass protests to demand snap presidential elections. The vote was boycotted by him, a charge he denies. Reports say after sacking the Prime Minister and suspending Parliament in July of 2021, a year later, Said pushed through a constitution enshrining his one-man rule after a vote that was also boycotted by the main opposition parties. Meanwhile, the new constitution replaced one drafted soon after the Arab Spring in 2011, which saw Tunisia overthrow late dictator Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali. It gave the head of state full executive control and supreme command of the army. Away from that, a Libyan court has sentenced 17 people to death after finding them guilty of joining the Islamic State group and carrying out atrocities in its name. The Tripoli court also sentenced 2 people to life in prison and 14 others to lesser jail sentences. According to a statement, they had been found guilty of other IS-linked acts and of having attacked the state and social peace, as well as armed violence in the western city of Sabratha and surroundings. Reports say those on trial had killed a total of 53 people, destroyed public buildings, and disappeared dozens of people. Libya's collapse into violence after the revolt that toppled and killed dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 left a power vacuum that was filled by a multitude of armed groups, including ISWAP. Meanwhile, the extremist group used Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte as its base from mid-2015 until it was ousted the following year. In another development, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia said it has resumed financial services in some towns in the northern region of Tigray, enabling residents to access their funds after shutdown lasting more than a year. The announcement follows the signing of a peace deal between the federal government and Tigrayan rebels last month, aimed at ending the brutal two-year conflict. The CBE branches having Shire, Almaty and Korem cities have started receiving money sent from abroad and locally, as well as depositing money. Moving now to Ethiopia country profile, where it is the Africa's oldest independent country and its second largest in terms of population, apart from a 5-year occupation by Mussolini's Italy. It has never been colonized. It has a monarchy that ended only in the coup of 1974. It served as a symbol of African independence throughout the continent's colonial period and was a founder member of the United Nations and the African base for many international organizations. Drought and civil conflict left Ethiopia in a state of turmoil under a Marxist dictatorship from the fall of the monarchy until 1991, when the long authoritarian rule of Meles Zenawi brought a degree of stability. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched a campaign of political liberalization at home and sought to end disputes with Ethiopia's neighbors, in particular Eritrea, and swiftly escalated into armed conflict. Elsewhere, the Rwandan High Court has ruled that the government's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda is lawful. The court ruled that the scheme did not breach the UN's Refugee Convention or human rights laws, but that the cases of 8 asylum seekers had not been properly considered and would need to be reconsidered. Meanwhile, Home Secretary Suella Braverman said she is committed to making the Rwanda policy work. After the break, we'll bring you the story of Sudan police tear gassing pro-democracy protesters. We'll be right back after the break. Thanks for staying tuned. Now dispersed thousands of people protesting against military rule. Reports said the demonstrators marched towards the presidential palace but were chased away by police. They dismissed a deal signed recently between the military and civilians, saying it was too vague. The protest took place on the 4th anniversary of the start of an uprising that toppled Omar al-Bashir. Meanwhile, he had been in power for 3 decades before he was forced out in April of 2019. The short-lived transition to civilian rule ended 2 years later when the military staged a coup. To Kenya now, where the governor of Nairobi has directed all state-run hospitals to release any patients who are being held because of unpaid bills. It is common practice for hospitals there to refuse to discharge patients until all medical fees have been paid. Johnson Sakaja said the county government would foot the bills and described the waiver as a Christmas gift so that people could celebrate with their families. Kenyans routinely complain that private and government-run hospitals charge exorbitant fees, which mean many are unable to seek treatment. In a separate development, deepening restraints are warning with potentially serious effect for a species already listed as vulnerable to extinction. When the UK last June announced a near-total ban on the trade in elephant ivory, an animal welfare charity studied what happened in 3 widely used online marketplaces. According to reports, this was deeply concerning evidence of increased demand for ivory from hippos, whose numbers in the wild are under threat. Meanwhile, researchers say this pattern was clear as far back as 1989, when a worldwide ban on trade in ivory was first agreed, and has only intensified as governments have brought in new measures to tighten the ban. Like ivory, hippo teeth and tusks are often used for decorative carvings, but they are cheaper and easier to obtain. We move down to Somalia, which was created in 1960 from a former British protectorate and an Italian colony. Somalia has collapsed into anarchy following the overthrow of the military regime of President Said Barre in 1991. As rival warlords tore the country apart into clan-based kingdoms, an internationally backed unity government formed in 2000. It struggled to establish control, and the 2 relatively peaceful northern regions of Somaliland and Puntland effectively broke away. The seizure of the capital Mogadishu and much of reports say the country's south by a coalition. Meanwhile, since 2012, when a new internationally backed government was installed, Somalia has been inching towards stability, but the new authorities still face a challenge from Al-Qaeda-aligned Al-Shabaab insurgents. Lastly, Benin, formerly known as Dahomey, is one of Africa's most stable democracies. Benin's shore includes what used to be known as the Slave Coast, the departure point for captives from parts of West Africa are still present in the Americas. These include Vodun, also spelled Vodun, Voodoo, or in English, Voodoo, which is celebrated at the country's annual Fête du Vodun or Voodoo Day. While the country has experienced economic growth over the past few years and is one of Africa's largest cotton producers, it ranks amongst the world's poorest countries. To the north, there have been sporadic clashes along Benin's border with Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, the trouble has been blamed on land disputes between rival for you at this time doing short fellows on social media. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, all of which you can find on our website, spectrumtv.ng. You have been watching Spotlight Africa. I am Uyai Anek, and thanks for watching, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.